Good afternoon. I think I've gotten the go-ahead that I'm supposed to start. I am Wendy Edelberg, Director of the Hamilton Project, and welcome to Brookings. Thank you for joining us for this event on meeting climate goals through tax reform. The tax code, where much of U.S. climate policy is implemented, will likely be the subject of intense policy debate in 2025. Today, the Hamilton Project releases a new analysis authored by John Bisling, Kimberly Klossing, Neil Mahotra, Jim Stock, and Catherine Wolfram, and it sheds light on the effectiveness and trade-offs of potential climate actions that could be taken by the United States. Much of climate policy operates through the tax code, and an important tax policy debate is imminent with the expiration of many of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act provisions next year. We are thrilled to have Senator Sheldon Whitehouse here for a fireside chat with Richard Rubin from the Wall Street Journal. Following their conversation, we will have a roundtable discussion between two of the analysis co-authors, Kim Klossing of the UCLA Law School and Jim Stock of Harvard University, with Shooting Pomerleau from the Niskanen Center, and it will be moderated by my colleague Sanjay Patnaik from the Center on Regulation and Markets at Brookings. Senator Whitehouse is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and also serves as a senior member of the Environment and Public Works Committee. Given these roles, he has a unique perspective on the intersection of climate and tax policy. You can submit questions for our speakers by tweeting or Xing at Hamilton Proj with the hashtag climate tax, or even better yet, email us at info@hamiltonproject.org. And I would now like to invite Senator Whitehouse and Richard Rubin up to the platform. Thank you.
Great. Well, we don't have an actual fire. We have water, so but we'll chat.
Can't you project a fire?
We need a projected fire. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for everyone for coming, and Brookings for hosting us. I'll start where Wendy left off, which is, okay, there's going to be an enormous tax bill next year, probably. All these things expire. That's complicated enough. How and why should complicated climate policy also become part of that discussion?
Really, because without that, we don't make it as a species in our customary habitat. And the report that came out today, I think, is pretty compelling, and it's supported by other similar reports, that it really takes carbon pricing to get to a pathway to climate safety. And as the consequences of our negligence on climate become more and more apparent, there's that motivation. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the 2025 opportunity when the Trump tax cuts all collapse, and there's huge room for negotiation created by that. And then third, you've got the CBAM, the carbon border tariff happening in Europe, that puts enormous pressure to get a price on carbon put together if you want to avoid being tariffed at the EU and UK level. So the forces are converging on making that work. And frankly, it ain't that complicated.
So, how do you evaluate the existing climate tax policy, right? The IRA was, in many ways, the largest climate policy that the U.S. has done. You were part of doing that. Mm-hmm. What about that has been effective, and what about that, since you're obviously pushing for a carbon price, is not enough?
It has been a very big tax subsidy push to move from fossil fuels to clean energy. But we know from everybody who's looked at it, including this recent report, that on its own, it does not get us onto that pathway to climate safety. So good step, but clearly not sufficient. So that kind of pushes us to look further into the tax system. And the dominant fact in all of this is that fossil fuel, according to the International Monetary Fund, lives on a $660 billion annual subsidy, which is what it gets by violating economic principle number 101 and polluting for free and having no responsibility for its harms. That is a really, really big economic signal to markets saying, oh yeah, keep going with fossil fuel. And it's a fake economic signal, and it's one that the fossil fuel industry maintains very aggressively through their political arms. But you got to make that go away if you're going to make markets work. So it's not just enough to boost subsidies and encourage the transition. You also have to deal with the fact that every single use of fossil fuel is heavily subsidized in a highly improper and dangerous way. And the sensible way to do that is to put in a carbon price.
And we've seen from House Republicans last year in their first debt ceiling bill, I'm sure we'll see it again, efforts to repeal pieces of the IRA to kind of, as a way to raise tax revenue to pay for other tax cuts often, or reduce the deficit or whatever. How do you think about kind of playing offense and defense at the same time from your perspective, sort of protecting what the IRA did, but then also making the case that there's more that needs to be done?
Well, I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Obamacare program, that was much reviled and despised, and now, other than Trump, basically, the Republican Party said, okay, we're going to live with this. We can't be taking away this program from people who depend on it in our states. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all. That's said very quietly. So you've got the example of these sort of immediate counter reactions that then with reality and time just fade, just pass away. So there's that. Then you can go to something like the COVID recovery legislation, where we did find stuff where we spent too much money and where it didn't make sense. And we're trying to take some of those things down because you experiment and you set a whole bunch of things in motion, and the ones that work, great, and the ones that don't work, you can take them down. And I'm sure that the IRA will have things that prove out to not have worked particularly well, and we can go back and rethink those parts. But I think the fundamental core of it is there to stay. And, Republicans may be voting against these things and for repealing them, but then they're going to ribbon cuttings in their home district supported by it, and they're all about it. So it's not a very consistent position, and I think that is a signal that we kind of are on the more Obamacare route for most of it, again, admitting that there probably will prove to be some excesses that should be trimmed at some point.
And so you've got a couple of different bills on carbon pricing. Can you just sort of, for the audience's sake, sort of walk through each of them, kind of what they do and how they work?
Super nutshell version is that one is a carbon pricing bill that puts a price on carbon at the basically port of importation or point of extraction. And then it's a carbon pricing bill, and because of carbon leakage, it has a carbon border adjustment sidecar. Mm-hmm. And then the other bill is the carbon border adjustment bill, which in order to get into the EU and UK club, you've got to have a carbon price domestically. So we have a carbon pricing sidecar on the carbon border tariff bill. So the two are a little bit reciprocals of each other, and both would make a very, very big difference. Obviously, the full carbon pricing bill would make a huge difference. One of the cool things about carbon pricing is that you can start quite small because you're dealing with corporate decision making. And if you jump in at a very high carbon price or jump in at a fairly low carbon price but ramp it up, you end up with about the same effect, but you save all that deadweight cost of just money going out of the system, but not allowing the corporate sector and the energy sector time to react. So you can actually start with a not particularly difficult carbon price. As long as people know where it's going, then they make the right economic decisions, and the price ends up being pretty moderate because they've made the right economic decisions.
Well, and the challenge at the beginning with any regulatory scheme is going to be getting the reporting and mechanics and administration and all those things right. Are those things easier to do if you're starting at a lower price?
They're pretty straightforward, and a lot of it's kind of there already. For instance, the EPA already keeps pretty good track of emissions to output so that you can have a comparison between one country and another country as to carbon efficiency. You'd have to do a little bit of work to figure out where the ports of importation or the places of extraction are to make sure you're taxing at the right place. But because it's a fairly narrow set of tax points, it's actually pretty simple to both impose and administer. And a good deal of, I think, the tax so-called penalty kind of gets lost in the system when you're applying the tax way upstream. And for some companies, they might not even run it through to the consumer.
As you think about where the revenue goes from that, right? So these proposals all bring in revenue, and the paper kind of outlines a couple of different ways that. What's your sense of, like, does that go to deficit reductions? That go, I think one version of your bill has money to help industries decarbonize. Another is sort of a cap and tax and dividend sort of thing. How are you thinking about what the right use of the money is?
Well, I think that we're in very, very deep trouble on climate, and that even very green members of Congress don't fully appreciate how bad it is and how bad it's going to get. So I think that the key is to find the things that will make the bill pass so that we can get that signal to markets as quickly as possible so that the adaptation accelerates. So, we basically had the gold plate West Virginia programs when we thought that might attract the energy chairman. And for communities that have been very dependent on fossil fuel and need to make a transition, you want to make sure that there are resources available for that so that the people who represent those communities don't become like warriors against the thing because there's nothing in it for them. So to me, that's the dominant piece of it. If that's achieved, then I've told my caucus, look, I want to get the bill passed.
And by the bill, you mean a price on carbon?
Price on carbon.
Yeah.
But how everybody wants to spend the money, I don't feel I have dominion over that. But we have deficit issues. We have significant investment and kind of like dead loss issues for equipment that was useful in a fossil fuel economy, but is now basically a write-off. There are plenty of good uses for the revenue, and I don't pretend to be the architect of all of that.
How far down the road are you in either talking with your colleagues or thinking through with your colleagues what the price of carbon pricing is, right? Like what it's going to take to get whatever the majority needed is next year, which we don't know what it is, but like how much of a sense do you have of what it's going to take?
Well, I think we'll find out a lot when people start getting tariffed through the European Union CBAM and what its baseline is. My understanding it's about $40 to $50 per ton right now. It varies because they've got a trading system that backs it up, but that's kind of roughly the number. My bill starts at about $20 and then goes up, and the sweet spot is probably around $50 looking out. The administration has just announced its social cost of carbon at $190 per ton, which is really strong and very exciting to see. So there's sort of a range of options. We got little Reggie at about 4 cents in New England. So that's not the great model, but there are an array of prospects out there that would drive you to the right number.
But I guess I mean the legislative price. How far along are you in figuring out what you've seen bills come together, you've seen bills fail. Like what does the coalition for this for carbon pricing look like?
I think it's getting to be pretty much everybody on our side, and then you've got a lot of pricing curious folks on the Republican side, particularly with respect to responding to the CBAM. If you don't respond to the CBAM and you represent a district that has a big cement plant that ends up exporting to the EU, or a big chemical plant that ends up exporting to the EU, they're going to be coming into you and saying, hey, WTF, I'm paying all these tariffs now, and why do I need to do that? And then you have to say, well, you need to do that because I'm beholden to the fossil fuel industry, and they want to pollute for free and not be charged for the cost of their pollution, so I'm going to have to let you be tariffed. That's a very awkward conversation to a big employer in your district. So, you know, there's the impulsive, that's not the right word, the propulsive effect of the CBAM on American policy, I think, is going to be profound.
And do you think this is something that is easier to do in a divided government, or is it like the IRA, where if you guys are in charge of everything next year, then that makes it easier to happen?
Well, if we are lucky enough to win a November trifecta, and I stay on as chairman of budget instead of moving over to EPW, that will be a very strong signal that we're back in action, and that we're going to do a second round, and that it will involve carbon pricing.
As you think about revenue, right? We talked about revenue and the climate goals. How do you kind of, with any sort of Pigovian tax, with any sort of pollution tax, they're always somewhat of a tension of, the more, revenue you get, you're getting revenue because the pollution is still happening.
Yeah.
How do you think about that balance? Like, how much should you want to rely on getting revenue versus
when does the revenue curve wear out?
Right. And do you want it to wear out? Like, how quickly do you want it to wear out?
Yeah. Well, from a climate point of view, I'm more than happy to have the revenue wear out. To have a big slug of revenue during the operative period of transition and price signal, I think is going to be extremely helpful. But my motivation isn't the revenue. My motivation is the climate solution. So I don't mind if the revenues peter out at some point. I mean, state governments get less revenue from cigarette taxes, but they save it in the hospital and healthcare and Medicaid support for people who aren't getting the same lung and heart conditions. I suspect that the savings of having fended off the worst of the climate crisis will dwarf the lost revenue.
One thing I was struck by in the paper coming out today is it talks about how in each of the scenarios, with a carbon fee without, with an expanded IRA without, it's that household energy costs stay roughly similar in this model. Now, that doesn't include things like the embedded costs of a carbon fee that show up in products. How do you think about? But I think the natural intuition for consumers will be, okay, well, the government is putting in this fee, that's going to make everything more expensive. We just saw the bad politics of what happens when things get more expensive.
Yep.
Like, how do you kind of address that on the policy and on the kind of rhetoric of this kind of bill?
Well, one of the things that's very helpful with the rhetoric that polling shows over and over again is once people understand what the sourcing is of the counter message, they're much more able to resist the appeal of the counter message. So it's really important to explain when it's fossil fuel financed counter messaging, really important to explain when the front group is a fossil fuel front group, really important to have the notion that there is a massive fossil fuel financed apparatus of deceit and obstruction that is out there operating all over the place, everywhere from pretending that offshore wind in New England is going to kill whales to that if we take care of the climate thing, your family is going to go bust. And it's really important to take on that machine. And then I think in real life, what you find out is that not much happens. If we had put a carbon price that would have affected gasoline prices, the surge in profits that the big oil companies have taken post-Ukraine would have completely absorbed all of that.
What do you mean?
I mean, they've made so much excess profit since they started profiteering post-Ukraine that it completely dwarfs whatever a sensible, like a $20 per ton of emissions carbon fee would have produced. So the market will absorb a lot of the price signal, particularly if it goes in at the very early stages of port of importation, point of extraction.
Okay, as a reminder, I think they were coming around with cards. If anyone has, or collecting cards, if anyone has questions, feel free to write them on the card and they'll pass them up to me. I've got some that people send in ahead of time, so we'll see if maybe we've covered all of them already.
But to put a number on the carbon pricing bill, we're about $2 trillion in revenues over 10 years. So that's a pretty good sized number and should be able to scratch a lot of itches in terms of making the bill palatable to a broader constituency going forward, even for people who aren't necessarily avid about solving the climate problem.
Right, because it creates a piggy bank to
reduce deficits with, to spend on things with, to fund
buy
really
votes
cool
if you want to think about it that way. Right. Can you talk about the international consequences, just sort of what, doing carbon pricing in the U.S. would mean for international trade policy and for relations with other countries?
Well, one of the cool things that comes out of the CBAM is that even if the United States does nothing and that our companies have to eat paying the tariff into the EU and UK for our exports there, take that as a given, we still are big net economic winners because the tariff that China will pay is about 3x the tariff that we will pay. And if you allow that adjustment into the pricing advantage that China has had, it pretty well neutralizes it. And if you throw in the way China has politicized its supply chain power, it has made buyers anxious about being dependent on China because of that possibility of sort of retribution through the supply chain, which we have not really featured. So between the two, what Bruegel and RFF and Silverado and the groups that are looking at this are all predicting is actually a pretty considerable move of manufacturing and supply chain from China to the United States. So this is another big win on top of chips, on top of infrastructure. And if we can get rid of the tariff, then it's all good. But the price of it is we got to have a bit of a carbon price internally, and the fossil fuel industries at some point going to have to just face up to that fact.
Do you see this as inevitable? Like what is the right? Like is this the 2025 conversation is one thing, but like when does this? What actually moves? I'm trying to think. Like we haven't seen.
Yeah.
Like I haven't seen the president talk about like this in quite the way you do. Like what actually, moves that bigger body politic in this direction?
So several years ago, the chief economist for Freddie Mac, the big mortgage company, predicted that there was going to be a coastal property values crash in the United States of America that was going to have the same national economic impact as the 2008 mortgage meltdown. Mm-hmm. And it was going to happen because of climate effects along the coast. And the logic is you can't insure because you don't know what the climate effects are, or you know that it's going to be flooded within the insurance period, so you can't get insurance. Well, if you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. And a property that can't get a mortgage is really hard to find a buyer for because you're reduced to cash buyers only, and that's the precipitating thing that causes the market to collapse. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the Florida insurance market right now, you see that insurance phase of that collapse already apparently swirling the drain with all sorts of alarms coming off of it. So something like that could happen that really brings these climate economic costs home to roost very quickly and very brutally. And that would send one hell of a powerful signal.
Yes, although often when there's like a economic crisis affecting a bunch of Americans, the legislative response is often bailout-ish more than like far-sighted policy. Like how do you kind of turn, whether you think the far-sighted policy is right or not, but like how do you sort of turn like with that sort of imminent?
Well, one way would be, hey, no bailout unless we solve the damn underlying problem of climate change with a serious climate price for once and for all. That's another opportunity to bring in carbon pricing if that's what you're if we're looking at a bailout. Of course, they've said they aren't going to pursue a bailout. Nothing to see here, folks, but that's not what it looks like to me right now.
What, as you refine your legislation for if 25 is prime time, what are kind of the big decisions that, besides where the money goes, what are the other big decisions that you're still wrestling with as you?
The big one is like, what's the best vehicle to really push to make sure that we're included in? So the 2025 10-year expiration of the Trump tax cuts is a big one. The opportunity for another reconciliation bill is a big one. A climate-related major emergency, probably emerging from the insurance industry, either because wildfire makes properties uninsurable, hence unmortgageable, or because coastal flooding makes properties uninsurable, hence unmortgageable. Those are the options, and you just want to pick the first credible one and go, and in the meantime continue to build the case that this makes perfect economic sense. I don't often have Milton Friedman on my shoulder like an angel, but like Milton Friedman said, you can't do market theory if you don't bake the harm of a product into the price of the product. Pollution costs have to be in the price of the product. And the fossil fuel industry has been cheating on that economic principle in the hundreds of billions for years and years and years. And that's just got to stop.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and there's some good ones here. Will state policies resisting siting of renewable energy facilities need to be addressed if you have a carbon price and you transition to clean energy?
I don't think so. I think the market takes care of that pretty quickly.
That states will basically accommodate projects?
Yeah.
Shouldn't we eliminate?
It's a little bit different. You've got a throughput project. Vermont is still, we'd love to get more Hydro-Quebec down into Rhode Island. Vermont doesn't necessarily love the idea of more transmission lines over the Green Mountains. So, you get transit effects like that. But where the end point is in the state, I think the market takes care of that well.
Shouldn't we eliminate subsidies before imposing a carbon tax? Like, how do the two work together?
Yeah, we should. But the subsidies for fossil fuel, I would say, are probably in the $60 billion range, and the like hard handout subsidies, and the big subsidy is the pollute for free license we've given them. That's the $600 billion. And so if you don't address that huge piece, then yeah, you should get rid of the little subsidies. But the big one that's driving behavior and that's deforming our markets in favor of fossil fuel is the pollute for free business model.
This is a question about the base for a carbon price. So, like, would this be only for hard-to-abate sectors, construction materials, petrochemicals, plastics, or do you kind of have to go into agriculture and other industries?
Well, we avoid that problem by having our point of taxation be, again, importation or extraction, and then you just let it flow through. We do build in exemptions if all you're doing is building a product that then you're going to export. And so that's part of reconciling with carbon border tariff questions and dealing with carbon leakage. But I think that's readily addressed by going to the best place to assess the tax, which is at the point of initiation.
This one is, who is voting on climate issues, which I think I take to mean, okay, like, it's important to a lot of people, but like, is it a dominant issue for a lot of voters given everything?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more that way. And the younger the voter, and the more they see a badly damaged set of planetary systems supporting human life in their actual human life, the more robust the ardor for getting this done. Somebody who's going to be dead in a decade doesn't need to get too excited about it unless they have a very good eleemosynary sense for others.
I didn't see this at this prior Hamilton Project event, but the card says that prior one that Paul Ryan endorsed a carbon tax, which I think sounds like something he might say. How do you find and work with reasonable partners across the aisle, and sort of in conjunction with that, what policies can be added in to get buy-in from the other side?
Well, we already have a number of Republican senators working on a carbon border tariff measure. we are working together in the sense that we're both commonly being supported by RFF and Silverado, who kind of are interchanging information so that we have basically technical analytical support for what we're doing, and we share that. So there's a good chance that that can come together, and the carbon border adjustment can be the opening bid to it. And then there's some, pretty unappealing things like, why the hell should we not be charging private jets for their emissions, or first-class tickets, or there are industries like the shipping industry that actually want to have a emissions price imposed on them because they want to clean up their act. They're going to make money anyway, and what they don't want is a striated system in which the good guys are getting outcompeted by the polluters. So they want a rule that brings all boats to level. So there are lots of entry points.
So we're just about out of time. Anything else that you wanted to add, or that that people should kind of keep in mind as they watch this issue go forward, as sort of very much alongside the major things that you'll hear the presidential candidates talking about this year?
I would say that when necessity demands, politics usually adapts. And I think the report today shows that necessity demands a carbon price, and that our politics will adapt to accommodate one.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
For being here.
Thank you all.
Next panel.
I didn't look at the diagram. I think somebody was sitting next to
Somebody told me I'm right here.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Sanjay Patnaik. I'm the Director of the Center on Regulation and Markets here. And just as a reminder, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them on the note cards. We're going to collect them throughout the event, okay? It's a real pleasure to be here today with three distinguished experts that are going to talk about the different economic and political implications of the policy choices we face, both in tax and climate policy. We have Kimberly Klausing, who is the sole chair in tax law and policy at UCLA. We have Pomerleau, who is the Deputy Director in Climate at the Niskanen Center. And we have Jim Stock, who is the Provost for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard University. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I want to set up the discussion today with a common assumption, which is that we want to achieve the emissions reductions that the Biden administration set. The goals that we currently have in place are a reduction by 50% by 2030 as compared to 2005 levels, and to make the economy net zero by 2050. Whether those goals are realistic, whether those goals are the most appropriate is a very different conversation. But given that the administration has taken a lot of measures to put us on the path, the question now becomes, how do we get there? How do we actually reach those goals? I want to turn to you, Kim. You had a paper here with Jim today and several other co-authors where you analyze different climate policy scenarios. You look at emissions reductions, you look at economic efficiency, which is super important, right? How much does it cost to reduce 1 ton of CO2? And also at fiscal impact. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the paper and the different scenarios and your thinking?
Yes, thanks so much. And thanks to Hamilton and Brookings for hosting this important conversation. So we look at 7 scenarios altogether in that paper, not because we like each of the 7 scenarios and think that they're all equally meritorious, but because we think they're all plausible outcomes for the future. Right, so the first scenario is just a reference scenario. It's a baseline that assumes that we keep the Inflation Reduction Act as it is, and that new regulations come into place, both the Section 111 power regulations, but also the tailpipe regulations from EPA. So that's the baseline. And then we compare that scenario to 6 other scenarios, 2 of which would entail less emissions reduction and the rest of which would entail more. So the 2 that would entail less, one is looking at a situation where the regulations don't come into effect, which could happen either due to court challenge or to other regulations being issued in their stead. Another scenario that would also entail fewer emissions reductions would be a complete repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act alongside, again, fewer regulatory measures. Both of those, are less ambitious climate policies than the ones we have presently. We also look at a series of scenarios that imagine more ambitious climate policy. One is a carbon fee, and it's a very modest carbon fee. It starts at $15 in a couple of years, rises slowly, and completely exempts retail gasoline, not because we think that's necessarily the right policy call, but because Americans tend to be quite politically sensitive to gas prices. Right, so we look at that very modest carbon fee layered on top of the Inflation Reduction Act. Another policy that we look at is sort of doubling down on IRA, saying, okay, well, the Inflation Reduction Act gets us some emissions reductions. What if we wanted more with a subsidy approach? And we look at expanding the power sector subsidies because those are the ones where you can get the most bang for the buck. A third ambitious policy that we look at is a clean electricity standard, and we look at a variant of that that's compatible with reconciliation and that is explained in the longer version of the paper, but that basically moves the electricity sector toward zero emissions over time, but with different paths for different regions of the country. And then we have one final scenario that's a kind of a compromise scenario where you could imagine sort of giving different groups some of what they want. So it would entail repealing parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, and we choose to retain the power credits, the ITC and the PTC, and the nuclear credits because those are the most efficient, and get rid of the rest of it, but also combine that with a carbon fee. Again, the same carbon fee that I described earlier. And so we look at all of those 7 scenarios and we compare them in 5 dimensions, and Jim will kind of go through what we found. But the North Star is, of course, emissions reduction. That's one key criteria, like how much are we reducing emissions. But also, as you mentioned, efficiency is very important. So we look at abatement costs per metric ton of emissions reduction. We also look at the fiscal impact. And as we saw in the prior conversation, 2025 is going to be a very important year because the Trump tax cuts, many of them are expiring. And there's a big push to extend a lot of these tax cuts, but it's very expensive to do so, in the neighborhood of $4 trillion if you just extend all the individual side things, but also the business provisions that are getting less advantageous over time. So this provides a moment for sort of a grand bargain in terms of fiscal considerations. And so we wanted to make sure to also look at the fiscal effect. And then finally, we look at the household energy expenditures because voters might be sensitive to that, even though we find that they don't vary very much. And then the impact of U.S. policy on policies abroad, which seems important given that this is really a global collective action problem.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Jim, maybe you can talk a little bit about the results and the findings, especially from an efficiency perspective, which I think is often overlooked.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks, Kim, for that great summary of the different scenarios that we consider. So let me actually just step back before I go through some numbers and underscore one thing that Senator Whitehouse said, which is that the Inflation Reduction Act is making a significant difference in terms of decarbonization of the power sector. It's driving electric vehicle adoption. It's driving hydrogen hubs. It is not nearly enough. So there was an important paper in Science this summer, a multi-model comparison where there were projections like what does the Inflation Reduction Act yield? The answer was that it yields maybe a 42% reduction by 2035 relative to the 2005 emissions level. Now, for those of you who are into this, the official Biden administration target and the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement is actually more like a 50 to 52% emissions reduction by 2030. So we are not on that path. We're not close to that path. Another way to say this is that because of fracking and some other things, we went down by about 20 percentage points by 2000, by just about now, and then we're projected over the next, say, 10 years under the IRA and under current policy to go down another maybe 20 percentage points. That means we still have 60 percentage points to go. So this is hard. And the question is, what is going to happen next? So I think it's really important to remember that. And the second comment I'd make at a high level is that the numbers we're talking about are big. They're big and for all of these, there's big differences in terms of the emissions reductions. There's big differences in terms of the fiscal consequences. One thing that doesn't have big differences is in terms of the economic efficiency. So all of the emissions consideration, all of the policies that we end up evaluating, or the legislative options that we end up evaluating, have relatively small costs in terms of cost per ton, economic costs to the system of emissions reductions. They're not all equally efficient, and we can parse that if you want, but they're actually, in sort of the big picture, they're all fairly efficient policies. Let me give you some of the numbers. In contrast to the summer paper, the paper this summer in Science, our scenarios actually assume that the power plant rule, the 111 rule, is in effect. So take the proposed rule and let's roll that in. The greenhouse gas tailpipe rule, CAFE standards that have been proposed, those are in effect. Let's roll that in. That might not be the greatest assumption. That was that's what, given the recent discussions about maybe relaxing that. But I think for first approximation, we're just assuming that those are rolled in. That brings us down to about a 49% under current law and those proposed rules, emissions reduction by 2035. If you repeal the IRA and you get rid of those standards, that is more emissions. That's about a 36% emission reduction. So it's going the wrong direction by about 7 percentage points. If you do the carbon fee, so this is a very modest carbon fee. This is not the $2 trillion revenue raiser that the senator proposed. This is $15 rising to $65 in 2035. So this is a modest carbon fee. That gets you to a 62% emissions reduction by 2035. That's a big emissions reduction. And then if you do this compromise proposal, which is eliminating a bunch of the IRA, whether you like that or not, let's just imagine that was something that happened, but you retain the power sector tax incentives and you add on the carbon fee, that's almost as good as just the carbon fee, and it gets you to about a 57% emissions reduction. So these are substantially large numbers. They really vary across. Now, the fiscal side, that varies a lot too. So the carbon fee, because we don't have the $2 trillion carbon fee, we estimate that might raise around $600 billion over a 10-year score. If you were to eliminate some of the features of the IRA in this compromise proposal, compromise scenario that we look at, and then have the carbon fee, that would actually raise about $1.4 trillion. So these are substantial numbers that could easily figure into tax debates. Let me say just a word about some of the other scenarios that we consider. Those are maybe the headline scenarios. You might think about, what if we just expanded the IRA? It turns out that that definitely makes a difference, but it's not a big difference. And the reason is that expanding the IRA, at a technical level, whether it's a bug or a feature, the IRA is neutral among fossil fuels. So it treats coal and natural gas in the same way. Whereas something like a carbon fee or a clean energy standard that we model is actually going to impose a higher price on coal. So a lot of the emissions reductions that we see in the carbon fee are from getting the coal out of the system early on, and that's not really a feature that's pushed by expanding the IRA. So there's a number of other considerations there. So doubling the IRA is not surprisingly a fairly expensive proposition. That would add, in our estimates, add something like $500 billion to the deficit in the way we estimate that. So there's a wide range of these different outcomes. These are big numbers. I guess the final thing I would say is, these are all just suppositions that we have about what might actually play out and what might look. Any real legislation or any real options are going to be more nuanced. People might have other proposals. I think one of the things that we're trying to suggest is that it's really important to bring some quantitative discipline to this discussion. Now is a good time to do it, maybe not in June 2025, but maybe now in terms of thinking about how we want to lay out what these different options might look like, and whether they're really going to accomplish the emissions and fiscal goals that we would have.
Great, thank you, Jim. I want to turn to you, Shooting. So you have a very interesting co-authored paper where you look at how to use a carbon tax revenue to extend the child tax credit. And so you call it kind of like a revenue swap, and you find that it could be distributionally progressive, it could be revenue neutral, and reduce poverty. Can you talk a little bit about the idea behind the paper and how that revenue swap would work?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much to Brookings for hosting this event, and to my fellow panelists, Kim and Jim, for presenting their fascinating work. I had the opportunity to pre-read their draft. It was wonderful, and if you all haven't already, I strongly encourage you to give their paper a read. Over the next few minutes, I would like to discuss a paper that I co-authored with Kyle Pomerleau, an economist at American Enterprise Institute, about using a carbon tax revenue to fund expansion of child tax credit. I would like to make it clear that we're not necessarily proposing using the carbon tax revenue to do this and this alone. As Senator Whitehouse just mentioned, climate change is a serious issue, and it's imperative that we put a price on carbon. So we're doing this paper looking at the fiscal, distributional, labor supply, and also work incentives of such a revenue swap. If lawmakers do decide this is the path forward for us to pass a carbon pricing in the U.S. So I'm going to talk about what this paper looks at, why we want to do this paper, and some high-level findings. The first is we look at 4 revenue swap options. So all the carbon tax revenue would be used to fund child tax credit expansion. We're holding the budgetary effect constant, so it's budget neutral. And it would be financed by about a $35 per metric ton carbon tax. Why we're doing this paper? So we listened to Senator Whitehouse discuss a lot about the importance of passing a carbon price in the U.S. I think one difficulty with a carbon price, which I'm sure we'll discuss later, is it's politically challenging. So the maybe number one common criticism of a carbon tax is that it may potentially burden low-income households disproportionately. Smart tax fiscal policy experts have looked at ways using the big pot of money to mitigate the regressive impact of a carbon tax. So there have been numerous studies out there looking at, let's use the revenue to cut corporate income tax or individual income tax, especially the employer side of the payroll taxes, or maybe let's just rebate the revenue back to households as dividends. Before we conducted this study, I don't think there has been any quantitative study looking at using the revenue to expand child tax credit to really mitigate the regressive impact. So that's one of the key motivations why we wanted to do this. Some highlights of the overview of our findings. A carbon tax, not surprisingly, on its own is slightly regressive, also has negative impact on labor supply. When we pair the carbon tax with any of the 4 revenue swap options to expand the child tax credit, it becomes progressive and also reduces poverty to different extent depending on the actual design of the child tax credit. Now, what makes it a little bit complicated is the revenue swaps effects on labor supply. It could exacerbate the negative impact of labor supply effects from a standalone carbon tax or mitigate some of them. I'll give you a quick example. If a child tax credit is pretty generous, a large credit, then of course it will make the revenue swap option progressive and reduces poverty. However, operating on a limited budget, lawmakers will have to introduce a phase-out threshold to eventually phase out the credit. And that is equivalent to increasing marginal tax for those households. So that would mean that would have negative impacts on labor supply. On the contrary to that, a smaller credit would actually mitigate some of the negative impacts on labor supply, but it would not reduce poverty or as much or be as progressive. I would like to throw out some caveats to this approach using carbon tax revenue to fund child tax expansion. The number one, as I discussed, it may have negative economic impact. Three out of the four revenue swap options we modeled actually have exacerbated the labor effects of a standalone carbon tax. So if you have a lower labor supply, it's associated to a lower economic activity, which might have a negative impact to the economy. So if lawmakers are interested in having a pro-growth or a policy that would actually stimulate economic growth, maybe cutting payroll taxes might be a better option here. Second is expanding child tax credit, of course, would not have any offsets for households without any children. So that's the downside of this approach. If lawmakers want to mitigate the negative impacts of a carbon tax to all the households, regardless whether they have or not have kids, I think rebating the revenue back to households as dividends, that might be a better approach. The second last caveat is we look at a $35 per metric ton of carbon tax, and all the revenue will be used to expand a child tax credit. We won't have any money left to help mitigate climate change or invest in clean technology, and it really depends whether there will be enough political appetite to really further increase the carbon price so we can have other revenue for climate-related mitigation. Lastly, I also want to point out it might be problematic to tie a carbon taxes revenue to any permanent program or benefits. Eventually, we want the policy to succeed, so emissions will eventually go down in the economy. There won't be as much revenue far down the road. So tying it to a permanent program expansion could be problematic. And that's maybe let me know if you want to read a copy of the paper. Happy to share, and looking forward to dive into the discussion.
Thank you so much. It's super interesting, especially the labor impacts. I want to take a step back, right? When we look at the paths forward, there are basically two ways to decarbonize. One is through a carbon fee or carbon tax, which all of us economists have preferred for a very long time, but there are political realities that make it difficult. And then you have the subsidy approach, which is like giving out carrots, like the tax credits, subsidies, et cetera, so that we can decarbonize the economy. So when you look at these two options, what are kind of like the different economic and political considerations around these two, and how would households and taxpayers be affected? I'd like to start with Jim. I found it very interesting, like the comments from the senator, because even the Democrats haven't really talked much about a carbon price. And so the question is kind of like, what is the path forward, and what are the considerations here between the two choices at the domestic front?
Well, I'm certainly not going to add anything to what this audience knows about the politics. So I'm going to try to stick to my knitting a little bit and talk about some of the economics maybe behind your question about taxes and subsidies. I think it's important. It's in a political sense, or the way it just sounds. It sounds like these are really different. Like a subsidy is really different than a tax, and of course, in some sense, it is. In terms of you're getting money versus you're paying out money. But what they really are doing from an economic perspective, these taxes and subsidies, is they're driving a price wedge between low carbon energy and higher carbon sources of energy, and from that perspective, it's really a question of how that price wedge is implemented. One of the important features about a carbon tax is that it's fundamentally a technology neutral tax. So it says the market, you should figure out the best way to get low carbon emissions. We're going to tax you this amount, and it's up to you to figure out how you want to do it. The subsidy structure, inevitably, it's very difficult to make a subsidy structure, not impossible, but difficult to make a subsidy structure that's truly technology neutral. So I mentioned, for example, that the IRA treats any fossil fuel the same. So coal and gas are treated the same, but they actually have different emissions profiles. So and then you have things like pathways through hydrogen and biofuels tax credits and so forth. And all of those behind the scenes have different implicit carbon prices associated with it, whereas a carbon tax is a much more technology neutral approach. And that ends up making it more efficient, which is to say, if you're going to spend a certain amount of money, you're going to get more emissions reductions. So if you're trying to look at the amount of emissions reductions you can get for spending a certain amount, you're going to get, as a society, you're going to get more through a carbon price. You'll also get a clean electricity standard, if it's properly designed, can be very effective in that regard. I think one other thing I would say, so if we think about sort of comparing these two, I think, all else equal, technology neutrality is a feature of a carbon price or a carbon fee that is desirable. On the other hand, there are desirable features of a subsidy because you can actually pick out technologies such as hydrogen, and you can say, we want to drive that technology forward, and we're going to do it by providing really ample subsidies, and those are going to be maybe far more than it might give you in a cost per ton, and you measure it in a narrow way, but we might be able to jumpstart this technology so that down the road, it's going to really pay off in a big way. And that was a feature of the IRA, and that's not going to come through a carbon tax. So actually, where I end up is that these could be very complementary policies. The subsidy enables a carbon fee that is going to be reducing electricity emissions, but it's going to be keeping the price down through the subsidy, and at the same time, having something like the hydrogen subsidy in place in the IRA is a way to try to jumpstart this industry. We don't know whether hydrogen is really going to be a fuel of the future for industry, or maybe it'll be a useful feedstock for making sustainable aviation fuels. But the only way to find out is really to try it in a substantial way, and the IRA, through the subsidy program, is able to do that. So I actually think that these are quite complementary policies.
That's actually a very interesting point, because I think people also often forget that a lot of the fossil fuel industry started with plenty of subsidies and state support, and to this day. Yeah. And oftentimes you need that to overcome the big capital requirements, right? Yeah. Shooting, I want to turn to you on this question. Kind of like you already alluded to it, that it's been very difficult politically even to talk about a carbon tax in the US, and I think the US is a bit different than most developed countries in that regard, because the EU has a carbon price, Canada has a carbon price in most provinces. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the politics and economics of both choices.
So I'm getting the harder question. Politics of a carbon price. I think Jim had a wonderful answer, very nice answer to the question. In terms of economics front, I want to add very, very quickly. I think if you compare tax subsidies and a carbon price, they're both kind of changing the relative pricings of clean energy and fossil fuels. The economics of that is the IRA tax credits. I think one overlooked discussion on tax subsidies compared to carbon price is the distributional effects. As I mentioned, a lot of people attack carbon pricing, saying it's regressive, it will affect low-income households disproportionately. I haven't heard much discussion on the distributional impact of tax subsidies and tax credits. And of course, tax credits, there's no reason to believe that on its own it's not regressive because it's cutting taxes more for higher income households. And I think the important question is, how would you finance the tax credits? I think the IRA is using the stock buyback taxes and the minimum taxes, which is make it more progressive. Because according to the CBO's latest estimate, that is not sufficient to fund the IRA tax credits. With the carbon pricing, I can sit here and talk for 2 hours how we mitigate the regressive impact of the carbon price. With fiscal policy experts and tax policy economists, with the clear layout distributional table, we know how we can use the revenue to really mitigate the effects. The question is if there is a political window or opportunity. With the politics, I don't think I have much to add in terms of the domestic politics in the U.S., as Kim alluded. Like, Americans seem to be very sensitive to gas prices. And I think I agree with what Senator Whitehouse just said, that when necessity demands, politics adapts. So we are looking at a huge pot of money, which could have a lot of different possibilities depending on how you use the revenue. So I think as policy analysts, our number one job is to really help lawmakers to analyze the trade-offs and benefits and costs of different policy options. I do want to add very quickly to the international perspective. I know Kim has a lot of experience in that. The politics of U.S. being kind of an outlier in the OECD countries, developed countries, of not having a carbon price is real. That is the reality. And what we're making decisions here at home about domestic policies have huge implications on other countries' responses, whether they're doing industrial policies like us, following the IRA model, or they're doing more protectionist tariffs, which is a perfect segue for me to lead it to Kim.
Thank you so much, Ru-Ting. And turning to you, Kim, and expanding that a little bit on the international scene, right? Like, we have these two policy choices, but climate change is a global problem. And so if we want to solve it, we have to reduce emissions globally. So how do the choices that we take here in the US affect other countries, and especially their policy choices on climate? And we are an outlier. I mean, we've seen that, for instance, when the IRA was passed, a lot of the Europeans were really concerned because they have a carbon price. They don't have the subsidies. So now companies are looking, where should I put my next plant? And the US looks very attractive, in addition to low energy prices. Yeah. So kind of like, what are the ramifications here?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I really like the way you framed it. It is a global collective action problem, and it's really a first-order question how our policies affect those of other countries, because we could have the perfect policies, and if other countries aren't also doing climate policies, you know, we all share one climate. So let's start with the Inflation Reduction Act subsidy approach. If you look at that, there were some real positives for other countries, but also some real negatives. On the positive side, we made a real commitment to reduce emissions in the United States, and it was a bold and serious policy commitment, which is something the United States has so far failed to provide. So I think that was reassuring to many in the international community that we took this problem seriously. A second benefit to the rest of the world is to the extent that there's learning and innovation in these industries, some of which are quite new and some of which are more established, right? We can hope that that learning and innovation spills over across borders and makes transitions abroad less expensive. But as you alluded, there are downsides, right? If our companies get paid to decarbonize and other companies get charged for their carbon emissions, right, that'll make our companies more competitive relative to companies abroad, and that will also distort the location of investment. And that's before we even get to the national content provisions that were within some of these subsidies, which are themselves quite problematic. So I think, you know, it's kind of a mixed bag when you look at where we are now. But there are important opportunities, and I think using this 2025 moment to think a little bit more holistically about how we might align with what other countries are doing and push forward the decarbonization agenda worldwide. This is a really important opportunity. As you mentioned, we're the only G7 country without a carbon price. Half of the OECD-rich country emissions are covered by a carbon price if you exclude the United States and look at the rest of the OECD. So we are an outlier. Let's say we added a small carbon fee, like the kind that we propose here, and let's say we worked with the EU and Canada and UK and others that are thinking of carbon border adjustments. This would be a chance to really move the ball throughout the world as people are thinking about the ideal policy response to that. Because a non-discriminatory carbon border adjustment sends a big signal to the whole world. Like if you're in China or if you're in India and you want to sell to the United States or Europe or Canada, right, you have to either carbon price yourself or you have to pay a tariff that really recognizes the carbon emissions in your production. And I think that 2025 is a nice time to think about this in the United States because we already have the groundwork of the Inflation Reduction Act, which should make things less expensive for households if we move in this direction because electricity and other utility prices will be falling, right? And because, as Shooting so nicely pointed to in her work, right, there's big trade-offs across fiscal policy tools. And if you can say, okay, sure, you may have to pay a little cost here, but you're going to get a bigger child tax credit because we'll have the money to extend that. Or we'll have the money to do an EITC, right? Or maybe we don't have to let the 10% bracket go to 12, right? I mean, you can imagine the different kinds of trade-offs that are happening in the context of tax reform, and it's going to be a lot easier to take that cost imposition to align better with other countries and then to hopefully do more worldwide to solve this problem.
I like that idea. And I think the international sphere can also be a place where we can look for some innovation. Some people might know there's a carbon tax in Austria, and it was passed in a coalition government between the Green Party and the center-right party. And they came to a grand bargain like that, right? Like they reduced income taxes, put a carbon tax, and then gave it back as a dividend to people across the country and more to people that live on the countryside that have to drive more. So I think there are a lot of new innovative aspects that we can learn from there. I want to kind of like go back a little bit to the IRA. And so the IRA is what we got, right? It's the best, second best solution because we didn't get a carbon price. And so we have it in place, and it might be, there's a lot of uncertainty about the election. It might be the legislative package we get for some time, right? And so when you look at the economic effects and how effective it has been in reducing emissions, I'm curious what you're seeing there. It's only been 1.5 years, so that's obviously a shorter time frame. But how does it compare in terms of costs per ton CO2 reduced to other measures? And how is it doing, basically? Shooting, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I'll take the first part of the question. I'll leave the cost estimate to Kim and Jim. I know they've done some work on this in their paper. I think if you look at it 1 year since IRA passed, there are some aspects that make the law attractive in terms of accelerating the deployment of clean energy. So what is new and kind of innovative about the IRA is, with the tax credits, is the refundability and transferability of the tax credits. So before IRA passed, if a third party is interested in purchasing the tax credits, if the developer doesn't have enough tax liability to utilize the tax credits, the third party would need to invest directly in the clean energy projects. The IRA changed all of that. It makes it refundable so that developers with little or no tax liability can utilize the tax credits. Also, it makes it transferable, so if any companies is interested in purchasing the tax credits from the developers, they can do so without getting directly involved in the project. So I think this new feature kind of is facilitating a new market, a big market out there for businesses to think of the transaction, how do they best invest, and then you hear announcements almost every year for every month of the last year, like this company is investing in this big facility in the state, that is happening. So I think that is the pros of the IRA. The downside or the big challenge, I think, Kim talked about this very briefly, is the Buy American rules. It's problematic because I think lawmakers and also the Biden administration, they're kind of, the way I see it, is struggling with two goals here. One is climate change is real. We gotta solve it as soon as possible. Let's do something. The other goal is protecting domestic industries, protecting domestic workers. Certain industries are picked as winners for the subsidy. So then you see the domestic content rules, the Buy American rules. For example, the EV credit, it has very strict and detailed thresholds for critical minerals, where it should come from, where you should assemble the EV. So I think a lot of people, like both people here at home and also overseas, our allies, will ask the question, like, what is a priority here? Are we trying to get the tax credits, get all the money out to all the businesses, including mature technology companies or also nascent technology companies, as fast as possible without any discrimination, for lack of a better word, as possible? Or are we more concerned about America first, like let's worry more about American competitiveness and the workers? So I think it's ongoing. We'll have to see. And I know like some allies are trying to negotiate free trade agreement with the U.S. to be eligible for the EV credits. And once they become eligible, the criticism of IRA kind of has quieted down. So I think we'll have to see.
I like your last point. I think that's a very important one because obviously, policies have different interaction effects, right? And then what are the priority rank orders that we see here? And I think the IRA has multiple, as you say, it's national security, it's supply chains, it's climate, but sometimes they're at odds with each other. And so then how do we decide which way to go more? So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Kim. Like, how well has the IRA been doing in terms of using taxpayer money to reduce emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I first and foremost, I think it's way better than nothing. You know, like, by all means, you know, it's, and if you look at the efficiency of it in terms of abatement costs per metric ton, like our estimate is the status quo, we're looking at about $43, right? Compared to the social cost of carbon, that's multifold higher, right? That's very good. You know, I share some of Shooting's concerns about ways in which multiple objectives have been targeted with a single piece of legislation that can ultimately reduce its effectiveness. But we do know from the early experience with this that companies seem very excited about this, that it is fueling a lot of behavioral change in a productive direction. When we looked at different scenarios in our paper, we found that there are some that can lead to a lower abatement cost per metric ton, and those are the ones that layer a fee on top, right, for logical reasons. But this drives a lot of progress in the electrification sector. It also drives a lot of transport progress as well, because it's quite sensitive to the carbon price in that respect. So I think one could do even better, right? But the Inflation Reduction Act is already changing behavior, and hopefully the models will be right, and it'll lead to much more emissions reduction than we would have had in the absence of that legislation.
Great, Jim. Over to you, and especially I'd like to hear from you, kind of like what's the impact on the fiscal balance in the U.S. Of the IRA, the potential impact, because a lot of the tax credits are uncapped, right? That means if more companies take them up, if more consumers take them up, the bill can grow pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, that's a sensitive issue in this town here. What's the fiscal impact of the IRA? I think, the original CBO estimates had around $380 billion as the total fiscal impact. There have been a number of studies subsequently that have pushed that pretty far north of that. I think in our estimates for over that 10-year window, we're in the $1 to $1.2 billion range. But those subsidies, a lot of those tax credits, you keep on spending them because if you're building a wind farm, and you then become eligible. You then lock in those credits for the next production tax credits for the next 10 years, so you can actually start having expenditures that continue outside the budget window. So the total fiscal cost over a longer window can be quite large. We were one of the, in a separate thing altogether, we were one of the first people to come out and say that the likely cost of just the EV components is more like $400 billion rather than what had been scored in the $20 billion range. And that's just because of the magnitude of EV penetration. It's not a complicated calculation, but it's important. So I think that's, those are significant costs. But I think I want to get a little bit away from just the fiscal, because it is important to think about whether these things are economically efficient. After all, we are going to need to spend money. Climate change is not going to solve itself. We're not going to decarbonize just by hanging out and crossing our fingers. We're going to have to do something. So what we want to do is do it as efficiently as possible, spend as little as possible to get as much decarbonization as we possibly can. And there's a range of these within the IRA. So the power sector credits are really quite economically efficient. Production tax credits, investment tax credits, and that's because solar and wind are pretty cheap, and giving them this little nudge is really making a big difference. Giving batteries a nudge, that's a little bit more expensive, but those cost curves are going to go down, and then we're going to be able to really have deeper penetration for solar and wind. That is a cost-effective part of the IRA. The consumer tax credits for electric vehicles, it's actually not even clear how much of that's going to be passed along to the consumer. There is a ton of activity in the IRA that's being induced by the IRA because of all of the battery manufacturing that's being done domestically, the ramp out in making eligibility for this $7,500, the two pieces of the $7,500 tax credit. That has lots of politically meritorious arguments potentially because of local domestic production or jobs, but that means that the money isn't going into the pockets of the consumer, it's going into the building of those new factories that are domestic. If we really wanted to do it as cheaply as possible, we might buy the batteries from China. There are reasons not to do that. So that's part of the trade-offs. And then other parts of the IRA are less cost effective. I think this question is still up in the air to see what the carbon capture and storage facilities end up coming in as costs. We don't know. We're going to learn that. That's part of trying to drive down costs for a fairly new technology, and there's an awful lot of new, really exciting technologies for carbon capture that are out in the wings that are being developed now by scientists because of, they're still in the lab or early stage production because of these subsidies. And so we'll see where that goes. And the same thing we've talked about hydrogen. So those are quite high if you measure them in cost per ton, but maybe the purpose is different to jumpstart the industry. So I think that one of the interesting features of the IRA is that it has this whole range of things, some of which really are driving solid, strong decarbonization in the power sector, but others have other purposes.
And you really bring up a very good point. I think we really need to hone in much more on this efficiency argument, right? Because we have limited resources to spend. And as you pointed out, the difference between like a $350 billion package and a $1.2 trillion, that's huge. Yeah. And that has a lot of fiscal implications, right? I got an audience question that is very nicely related to this, which is obviously the economic efficiency is one aspect, but the impact on consumers, on households is another one, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd really love to hear from you, how would these policies affect household energy costs, cost of living? I mean, some of these costs might pass through to products, right, as companies pay that carbon price, if we have a carbon price. And we already see people struggling with the high cost of living. And we have seen some backlash to climate policies because of that in Europe, for instance. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Jim, maybe this time you want to start.
Yeah, this is such an important question because, of course, what consumers actually pay for energy is absolutely top of mind. Some of the things are maybe potentially a little counterintuitive and pretty interesting to think through. So let me give you two sets of runs. One is repealing the IRA and repealing and the proposed fuel efficiency rules and the proposed 111 rule, the power plant rule, just get rid of them all. Okay, so that's option one. And option two is just keep the IRA and let's throw on a carbon tax. Which is more expensive in terms of energy costs for consumers? You'd probably think the carbon fee is more expensive, but you'd be wrong. And the reason for that is that the carbon fee plus the IRA is driving, just giving the nudges to switch over to electric vehicles and to get more wind and solar. And in the long run, that wind and solar is a lot cheaper than keeping the coal in the system. And those electric vehicles, the energy cost is just a lot less. So households are actually saving on gasoline. Now you might say, wait, this doesn't sound right. How could that happen? Why isn't that a free market solution? And the answer is, you've still got to buy that electric vehicle, right? So you're going to have, so this is not getting, something is not a $20 bill lying on the sidewalk. But from a consumer energy cost perspective, the carbon fee actually has lower consumer energy costs across their entire portfolio than repealing the IRA.
Shooting. What are your thoughts on this? Cost of living.
I think that's an important question. Ultimately, the cost of living is in the incentives, what's driving the change of consumer behavior. I would like to add quickly that another perspective to look at the IRA is it's some of it may lead to waste of tax dollars that taxpayers are paying because you're kind of subsidizing energy, and if energy becomes cheaper overall, yes, some consumers might be switching to cheaper clean energy, but if the energy prices fall overall as a result of the subsidy, some consumers may increase their overall consumption of energy, which could lead to some of the waste of the taxpayers' dollars.
That's actually interesting. And I want to follow up on this a little bit, also related to what the senator said earlier in another question, which is the issue of subsidies for fossil fuels, right? Because that's also often tied, especially in other countries, to people being able to afford energy. So what are your thoughts on that in the United States? The fiscal and the economic implications.
Yes. If you look at fossil fuel subsidies, I think it's a problem in the U.S. tax code because on one hand, we are subsidizing fossil fuels energy in the U.S., but on the other hand, we're subsidizing significantly also clean energy. So this goes back to a discussion like, what's your goal here? What do you want to do? Do you want to increase the U.S. domestic production of fossil fuels, or do you want to address climate change? I would add that 3 quick points. First, fossil fuel subsidies is problematic. A better policy would be to repeal those subsidies and introduce a border-adjusted carbon tax. And we can sit down and discuss whether we add that to an IRA or repeal. That really depends on the political process. Second is, what is subsidy? What is the definition of subsidy? I think that's a very important question to answer before we go into the discussion of the magnitude of the fossil fuel subsidy. So if a fossil fuel company is getting favorable tax treatment, but all other companies, not only within the energy industry, but also outside of the energy industry, like the tax treatment of inventories, like first thing for FIFO and LIFO. Kim is probably more familiar with these than me. The tax treatment of inventories, if it's applicable and available to all companies across all industries, should it be cost subsidy? So I think when we talk about subsidies, it's super important to remember whether we're talking about the tax expenditures as the total, the size of it, or the difference of the favorable treatments the oil gas industry is receiving compared to other industries. My last point, which is directly answering your question, Sanjay, is based on multiple agencies and the academic literature estimates, the size of the fossil fuel subsidy in the U.S. is relatively small. According to Joint Committee on Taxation, over a 5-year budget window, 2022 to 2026, the total tax expenditures, not subsidy, tax expenditures for fossil fuels is about $11.8 billion. And the CBO estimates that it has a very minimal effect on domestic production of oil. It would only increase the domestic production of oil by 0.4 to 0.8%. Because of the relatively small size of the fossil fuel subsidy and the minimal impact it could have on domestic production and the prices, because oil and gas prices determine in the global markets. It's probably better to leverage the political capital to focus on what is a meaningful domestic policy, climate policy in the U.S. After we repeal the subsidies for fossil fuels, we still have a long way to go.
With more impact, right? That's great. We're almost at the end, so I want to have like a concluding question, very briefly, each one of you, please, which is something the Senator mentioned, which is that there's really very good, I think, very good movement, a bipartisan movement towards a potential carbon border tariff, or CBAM like it used to be called, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So what are your thoughts of maybe, do we see a CBAM in the future as part of a grand tax climate bargain? Kim, you want to start first?
I think it would be great to see, as long as it was non-discriminatory. I'm more wary of some of the proposals than the senator is, and particularly the proposals that wouldn't accompany it with a domestic price. He's very careful in his proposal to do that, but there's a bill out there now, the Cassidy-Graham bill, that does not do that, and I think that could be quite dangerous, in fact, to efforts abroad. Another thing just to quickly highlight on the trade front is that the design of the carbon tax itself can have a big implication for how much revenue it raises based on how you're treating exports. One thing that we learned in the process of doing this analysis is that the U.S. is a fossil fuel exporter and is going to be only more so a fossil fuel exporter over the coming decades. So if you look at what you can get from a carbon fee in the presence of the standard design, which is to levy it on the consumption basis, it's about half the revenue you would get if you levied it on a production basis and didn't bother with the rebate at the border. And I just think that's a useful thing for policymakers to chew on in terms of thinking about whether you might want to do this on the production basis. And similar to how the Europeans have also handled their situation, is they're not rebating at the border either. So that could help align us again with actions abroad in a way that motivates action, hopefully.
Which would be critical, I think. Shooting, I know you have a lot of opinions about this.
Yeah, carbon border adjustment, my favorite topic. I will mention 2 points. One, I completely agree with Kim that it's imperative that we talk about carbon border adjustments in the context of a domestic carbon tax or carbon price. There's a lot of chatter and attention and interest in doing import tariffs. They love to call it border adjustment. I think it's a more grand word. You can hide a lot of goals in it, but I think it's clear that the potential negative effects of standalone import tariffs, and from economic perspective, political, geopolitical, and international trade compliance perspective, it's super important to talk about that in the context of a domestic carbon tax. Second is, I would like to reiterate that it's very important for us to have a meaningful domestic climate policy, whether it's on top of IRA or repealing some of IRA, to help us get there, to meet the climate goals. There's a lot of momentum and narrative that let's punish dirtier countries exporting their goods. We need to realize for the biggest polluters like the US, China, Russia, EU, a majority of their emissions are embedded in domestic consumption. Only around 20% are for exports. So like one quick statistic I would like you all to remember when you read news articles going forward is in 2018, all of the US's imports from China only accounted about 4% of their total emissions. And we're talking about every good and services if we were to impose import tax. So what carbon border adjustment tariffs could do is actually very limited if you're serious about addressing all the emissions globally. So having a non-discriminatory, well-designed policy is all that more important.
Perfect. Jim, last word.
I'm going to be very quick because we are, I think, technically out of time. And these are both excellent responses. I will sort of make, I think, Kim's point and the senator's point a little bit more provocatively, which is that a carbon border adjustment without a domestic carbon price, I don't view that as climate policy. That's not reducing emissions. Climate policy should be reducing emissions. That's imposing a tariff because we want to impose a tariff under a different name.
Something to think about. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.